Mishcon Academy digital sessions.
Last November, you gave oral evidence to the House of Commons Digital, Culture, Media and Sports Committee, so the DCMS, in relation to their inquiry into sports governance. So the DCMS's conclusion was, we have a young man who had his dreams shattered by institutional racism, bullying and abuse. I remember when I first saw the headlines last August, and quite frankly still now, I'm just heartbroken by what's happened to you. So I'm in equal measures delighted and sad to have you here to share your story, which is a really important story for us to hear. The purpose of our conversation is threefold. So first, to explore what happened. Second, to understand why this ended up at DCMS's door. And third, and perhaps most importantly, to talk about whether this is the turning point. Can you tell us about some of the examples of the types of behaviour you faced which led to DCMS coming to that conclusion?
Moving to Barnsley from Pakistan, July 2001, we came to the UK, and then I remember it, 31st of October 2001, moved to Barnsley. Straight after 9/11, I think everyday life, school, racism, hearing the word Paki had become very normalised, and it was part of any person of colour growing up in the UK, part of their life. Cricket at the start was actually a nice escape. Somewhere I got a bit of respect, I felt, somewhere I could be myself, and somewhere where I could flourish. But as we sort of start playing and get into it, pretty early on as a 15-year-old at my local cricket club, I got pinned down and red wine poured down my throat, which, yeah, I look back at it and I wish I'd said something at the time, but I can see why I didn't, because if I'd gone home and told my dad, I would have never played the game ever again. And then as I go to the Yorkshire and come to the professional ranks, and there was a time where I started trying to fit in, because all I wanted to do was play cricket for England. Initially, when I first went into that environment, I'd say I was confident, but religious guy. But as it became clear that unless I started doing some of the things which is against my religion, drinking, going out, that I wouldn't progress. And slowly, without even realising, I started doing them things. But even then, I remember being on nights out and my teammates coming up and saying, "Why are you talking to him? He's a Paki." And that, like I said, as I look back now, I was left outside crying a lot of the times. Then you had a game pretty early on in my career, playing with some of my biggest heroes, people I watched on TV, and as you walk onto the field, you get a comment, "There's too many of you lot, we need to have a word about it." Now, none of my testimony or when I've spoken have I said that any of this stuff was done in a malice way. But slowly, it was clearly chipping away at me, and even without me realising, from 2014 onwards, I was on citalopram, really struggling but not knowing why I'm struggling. And like I said, it wasn't until right at the end that it became clear to me what it was that I was going through.
Let's now talk about why this ended up at DCMS's door. So by way of background, you were at Yorkshire Cricket Club from 2008 to 2018, so roughly 10 years. And you spoke up whilst at Yorkshire Cricket Club, and you spoke out in 2020. Many of us, specifically me, admire you. You were brave enough to stick your head above the parapet and call out the wrong. What gave you the determination to do that?
When I first raised a complaint was in 2017 while I was still at the club. And like I said, until right at the end, even as people of colour will relate to it here, you don't want to believe that you're being treated differently because of your colour or because of your religion, because then you start seeing everything that way, and it's really difficult, it's draining. So clearly, until 2017, when I first raised a complaint, even then I raised it as bullying initially. And And then it was really in 2018 when I lost my son, and the treatment I got around that. Like I said at DCMS, pretty inhuman. And it was at that point that I looked at myself and I thought, I'm looking the other way here. I've seen lads, my teammates, have tragedies, as people do in life, and the support has been above and beyond. And here I am, going through a pretty difficult 12 months, the pregnancy, and then eventually losing my son. And my first day back, I get brought into a room and literally rip the shreds off me from the director of cricket. And I'm like, hold on a minute, this is not right. And at that point, I was like, I've been treated differently here because of my race and my religion. Even at that point, I raised it internally. I went and had a meeting with the director of cricket, the chief executive. I had a PCA board member in their Professional Cricketers Association, who I thought was on my side, but which later became very clear that he wasn't, and a friend. And I just spoke my heart. I'd been to the House of the Inclusivity and Diversity board member, literally cried my eyes out. And all I wanted was a few answers as to why certain things happened, and then how we were going to make sure it didn't happen again. And they got rid of me 7 days later. At that point, I was in no fit state to, do anything really. I'd just lost my son. I'd just lost my career. And probably, I thought, I'd lost all faith in humanity. I went to Pakistan. I handed my keys to my dad and was like, you deal with everything, I'm gone. But one thing I was pretty determined to do at some point was speak about it. But it was never meant to be when I actually ended up speaking about it. So we come to 2020, and the Black Lives Matter. I saw an interview that the director of cricket has done with the Yorkshire Post, talking about how he'd never seen racism off the back of Black Lives Matter. And Michael Carberry speaking out. He'd never seen racism in the dressing rooms, never been part of it, and all this. And I read that, and that hurt. And then I saw Yorkshire put some diversity logos on their shirt, and that really irritated me. But I was in no fit position still to be taking on who I know to be a massive institution, and I knew it wasn't going to be easy for me. And one thing I've been very clear from the offset is, I don't claim to be perfect. I made some horrible mistakes, and I regret them. But that doesn't mean that I should have been subjected to racist abuse. So I just opened recently a new business, and I had an interview around that. And I got asked a question whether I'd faced any prejudice. And I got emotional. I'm a very emotional person, and my emotions took over and I said everything. But even at that stage, the journalist in the Wisden article, it was like 3/4 of the way down. It mentioned it and it went into it, and I didn't really go into full detail. But it was Yorkshire's response at that point. They basically palmed it off like it didn't matter. And it reminded me of when I went and spoke to them in the room. And the arrogance and the ego of just thinking that they were above everything, and it wasn't something that they needed to respond to. Again, that sort of built a few more emotions of irritation. I did a podcast with a journalist, Cricket Badger podcast, and that was really, one, the bloke had worked at Yorkshire, so he knew some of the things, but I spoke a little bit more, and Yorkshire's response was, well, he's not mentioned Yorkshire, so he must be talking about someone else. I mean, I'd played for Derbyshire for 1 month, but apart from that, I'd played at Yorkshire. Again, but it was really, James Butler, the Cricket Badger podcast, he was like, look, I can't take this any further. I'm going to get in touch with George Dubell, who was a journalist at Cricinfo at the time. And George got in touch with me. But that day, the Hanif Malik, the Inclusivity and Diversity board member, got in touch with me. And I just said to him, look, are you getting in touch with me on a personal capacity or as in part of the organisation? Because the last thing I want is I speak to you, have one conversation, and you go to the press that you've been supporting me. Half an hour later, in my conversation with George, he gets a message from the club saying the Inclusivity and Diversity board member has been supporting me throughout. Yeah, again, pretty frustrating. So then I did this interview with George, and it was when George did the piece that it started to, this is September 2020, this is when Yorkshire knew that they needed to do more. And then they go on and announce an independent investigation, which we're going to talk more about.
So it's about 1 month after you spoke out, so you told the media about what had happened, that Yorkshire Cricket Club instructed an external law firm to conduct an investigation. So I'm curious about what you thought of, so A, what you thought about the timing, and B, what you thought about the actual investigation. What did they do well? What could they have done better?
We can talk about what they do well, and that conversation ends quickly, but
That's easy done.
I mean, they got kicking and screaming into doing anything. Like I said, George DeBell's a very senior journalist, and that hit the waves, and then I did a few interviews. So they had no other option but to do something. And I think what they thought, and what generally is difficult in these circumstances, because you start getting gaslighted and it all gets put back on you. So I think they thought, well, we'll announce this independent investigation, which the chairman at the time, he actually had been associated with that firm in his training days. So straight away, it wasn't very independent in my eyes. Again, they created this panel which had 2 people on it who had gone to for help in the first place. So fighting all of that. But initially, I think what they thought is, look, he's going to come, he's going to say a lot, it's going to be a lot of, it's a bitter ex-employee, there's going to be no substance to anything, and they can sort of use an independent investigation to, because they announced that it'll be over in 3 months. When I met them, we had an 8-hour interview. Wow. And I think their attitude before the interview and after, they knew they were in some trouble now. They couldn't do what they were actually coming in to do, which is sad, but it's the reality of the world we live in. These so-called independent investigations, as we've seen recently, aren't really very independent. So as soon as I had my interview, I felt like everything, their language, the way they treated me, all became about how can we now. It felt like at times they wanted me to just pull out of the investigation, but I was pretty determined to make sure I gave all the information and then let them see what they did. It was supposed to end in December, we got to February, we got to March, April, May, June, and then I think it was, they came to the conclusion, or Yorkshire came to a conclusion and announced that I had been the subject of inappropriate behaviour. To say that irritated me would be an understatement. To see that they tried and attempted to put racism as inappropriate behaviour was hurtful. And at this point, I think everyone was starting to look at this from an outside and going, what's going on here? And then they decided they went from that to picking the morning of the Old Trafford Test match when the Test match was called off, which is quite a big news. They announced there was no doubt that I was a victim of racial harassment and bullying. So you think, all right, starting to learn, but they didn't send me the report and announce this. And it was such a complicated and messed up process that there was the law firms did the investigation, then they gave their findings to the panel. Panel then decided their part of it, then gave their interpretation of it to Yorkshire. Then Yorkshire's lawyers, very independent, Yorkshire's lawyers decided what everyone else would see and then put their spin on it and put it out to the public in this way, morning of the Test match. So they went from inappropriate behaviour to no question, and then a few weeks later, that none of their staff had done anything wrong, and there was going to be no disciplinary to them.
Would you say that's why DCMS became involved, because of that whole sort of scenario?
Well, it started bubbling. So from the inappropriate, I think Julian and I had given a quote at some point just before that, and then, like I said, people were starting to look and see what's happening, because it was gathering bigger and bigger. More media was starting to get interested. But it was actually, so the report which I got sent, not a full version of so a redacted version of the report.
Yeah.
So I didn't even, so my allegations, I didn't even know how they'd come to some of the findings they'd come to. But the report ended up being leaked and found its way into the press. And Monday, I think it was the 1st of October, and George DeBell wrote an article from the report that the panel and the investigation came to the finding that the P word was used as banter.
Should we just pause there for a second? Yeah. Just as banter, right?
P word was used as banter, and they said that I had used the word Zimbo, which I don't deny using, and if I was at the club, I should be disciplined for that. Yet a week earlier, they decided that P word was used as banter and that none of their employees were involved.
So during the oral evidence, DCMS said, it's all very good talking about initiatives and EDIs and banding words around, but the point of the matter is 85%, I mean, this to you and I is quite common, right? 85% of kids at Bradford Park Nets are of South Asian background. Yet, we've had 4 British-born Asians representing Yorkshire in the last decade. 4. So my next question is 2 parts. First, is this the turning point? Is this the turning point? And how do we create change in cricket?
Short term, accountability is very important. So through this, a clear message needs to be sent out that it is actually zero tolerance, and it's not just a word that's put on a document. Frankly, I'm quite, since November, do I think things have changed enough? No. I feel like action plans and these PDFs and PowerPoint presentations are still, again, the direction the game seems to want to go down. There needs to be, for me, a clear reporting mechanisms. So if one tangible thing that's going to be learned from this situation is how many people I had to go to and continue to go to be heard, that shouldn't be the case. People should feel like there's a clear avenue they can go down if they want to speak up. Secondly, I think in education, but again, education's just thrown out. What does it actually mean? I think I've been lucky enough to be part of some organisations that work in this space, and I was part of an Anne Frank youth conference, and the way they educated young kids around discrimination and what effects it has. I think cricket needs to look outwards for that, into the corporate world, because I feel like cricket's a long way behind. And the third thing, a part of it, is opportunities. I think cricket, like society, I think we need to actively go out and tell people that there is opportunities there for them. So I think combination of that, hopefully, would, in sort of 4 or 5 years' time, we can all look back and go, you know what, we all played a tiny little part in the game that I love, cricket changing, and in effect, hopefully, society changing. It was actually quite scary how much of this was actually in the public domain. Imran Khan in '99. Yeah. ECB did a report in 2001, the Fletcher report that the ECB had themselves commissioned it. But you know what? I'm very determined. I'm very determined for a few reasons. One, I've put myself and my family through a lot of pain. And if nothing comes off that, I would have failed. That's the way I see it. And I've been handed a responsibility and a platform, and people see me as a voice for them. And as difficult as it continues to be for me, I'm pretty determined to make sure that I fulfill that responsibility. So a very simple message for the game, the ECB of Yorkshire, Azeem Rafiq's going nowhere until this changes. So in terms of the actually changing, I'm very determined that this will change this time around.
There's no way you can fail in this. The very fact that you're here, the very fact that you're changing narratives, the very fact that the ECB and Yorkshire Cricket Club are doing things is success in itself. Obviously, there's varying degrees of success. Thank you, Azeem, so much for coming in, and thank you for sharing your story. And
well, I mean, thanks for having me, and just if I can leave with thank you for everyone for being here. But it's all our responsibility. It really is. It's not a person of colour or white person or anything like it. Literally is humanity. Yeah, just be allies. Don't be bystanders. And yeah, hopefully, like I said, we can all look back in 5 years' time and say we played a tiny little part in the dial changing in this country.
Thank you very much.
The Mishcon Academy Digital Sessions. To access advice for businesses that is regularly updated, please visit mishcon.com.